Have you ever wondered what really happens when we close our eyes for the last time? That final moment when the last breath escapes our lips and the heart stops beating. Where do we go? What do we feel? Are we even aware? This might be humanity's biggest question. A mystery that transcends cultures, religions, and time periods. Ancient civilizations tried to unravel this enigma, from the Egyptians with their Book of the Dead to the Tibetans with the Bardo Thodol. But today we go beyond mere guesses. We're going to explore what really happens in the first moments after death, based on decades of in-depth studies and consistent accounts. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. If this topic touches your heart or sparks your curiosity, be sure to like this video right away and hit the bell to receive more content like this. Every interaction helps us bring these truths to more people who, like you, are looking for answers to the great mysteries of existence. Imagine this: one moment you're here in the physical world, and the next, you find yourself somewhere else, but it's still you. Can you feel the weight of that reality? That's exactly what we're going to uncover today. Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, conducted more than 14,000 psychic readings while in a deep trance. Out of those, over 2,500 records detailed what happens to the soul after the physical death. We're not talking about mere speculation or vague theories, but about detailed and consistent descriptions obtained over 43 years of documented work. Cayce described the process with amazing clarity. In his readings, he managed to access what he called Akashic records, a kind of universal library where all human experiences are stored. This man, who had only an elementary school education, was able to enter altered states of consciousness and bring back information that later scientists would confirm in their research on near-death experiences. What makes Cayce's descriptions so convincing is their consistency. Even when questioned by skeptics, doctors, and scientists of his time, his descriptions of the transition process remained coherent and rich in details that could only be known by someone who could really see beyond the material veil. Imagine waking up from a deep sleep in an unfamiliar room. That's often the first sensation the soul experiences after leaving the body. There's a moment of pure disorientation, a suspension between realities. You still feel like you are you. Your thoughts, memories, and personality remain intact, but something fundamental has changed. James, a 67-year-old man who died of a heart attack, described through mediums researched by Cayce that his first sensation was one of extreme lightness, as if he had left a heavy coat behind. He could see his wife crying beside his body, and his immediate impulse was to comfort her. "I'm okay, honey. I'm here," he tried to say, confused that she neither heard him nor felt his presence. This initial phase is what Tibetan mystics call the bardo of death, an intermediate state where the soul is still strongly attached to its earthly identity and to the loved ones it left behind. Most souls stay in this state of observation for a period that varies according to their attachment to the material world and their understanding of the death process. Many souls describe a sensation of floating above the body, watching everything that happens. Doctors attempting resuscitation, family members arriving, the tears, the embraces. It's like watching a movie in which you were the main character, but now you are just an observer. This veil of confusion, as Cayce called it, can last moments or even whole days depending on how prepared the soul was for the transition. It is at this moment that the real challenge of the transition begins. Attachment, this invisible force that connects us to people, places, objects, and situations, becomes the main factor determining how long the soul remains in this intermediate state. Maria, a mother of 3 who died in a car accident, simply could not move on. Through documented medium communications, she reported that she stayed in the family home for almost 2 years, watching her children grow up, trying to protect them, leaving little signs of her presence. "I just couldn't leave them," she explained. "Not when my youngest was crying every night calling for me." This phenomenon is extraordinarily common. Business people who can't let go of their companies, lovers separated by death who wait for a final goodbye, people who depart with unresolved conflicts. All these situations create strong emotional anchors that keep the soul close to the earthly plane. Cayce described these intense emotions as psychic magnets, real energetic forces that literally hold the consciousness to certain places or people. That's why so many stories of apparitions and spiritual presences occur in locations of great emotional significance to the one who departed. This attachment is not just emotional but also mental. Limiting beliefs like, "I need to take care of them," or "I have to finish what I started" create true traps for consciousness. Carlos, a man who died suddenly at 42, reported being stuck in his office for months, desperately trying to finish an important project, unable to accept that his time in the physical world was over. Cayce's studies reveal a clear pattern. The stronger the unresolved emotional attachment, the longer the soul tends to remain in that intermediate state. And this doesn't happen as a punishment or a failure. It simply happens because love and worry are powerful forces that even transcend the barrier of death. What many do not realize is that after death, our feelings not only influence our experience, they literally create the environment we experience. Cayce describes a fascinating phenomenon. The soul, freed from the limits of the physical body, begins to notice that its emotional states manifest as real landscapes around it. Martha, a lady who led a life of service and kindness, reported awakening in a garden of colors that are impossible to describe in human words. Flowers responded to her thoughts. Crystalline waterfalls seemed to sing melodies she had only imagined during her happiest moments. It felt like all the beauty I ever tried to create or appreciate in life was now amplified and alive all around me, she described through documented communications. Robert, a man who carried deep regrets and unresolved anger, initially found himself in a gloomy setting, with dense mist and a feeling of isolation. There were no visible walls or limits, but I felt confined by my own guilt, he reported. The fascinating thing is that as he began to process these negative feelings, helped by loving presences, the environment around him gradually transformed. Cayce called this instant emotional manifestation, a process where the soul's inner state instantly creates its external environment. There is no longer a separation between what we feel and what we experience. On Earth, our thoughts and emotions eventually shape our reality through our actions. In the spiritual realm, this process is immediate and transparent. This phenomenon explains why some souls describe such different experiences after death. It's not a matter of separate heavens or hells, but of distinct states of consciousness. The life review, so often mentioned in near-death experiences, is part of this process. Each memory is not simply reviewed, but relived with full awareness of the impact our actions had on others. And in this emotional map, the memories do not follow a chronological order, but rather an order of emotional intensity. The moments that most marked our soul, for better or for worse, emerge in crystal clear detail, revealing truths about ourselves that perhaps we avoided facing during life. I wasn't alone. This is one of the most consistent statements in accounts of experiences after death. At some point in this initial journey, almost every soul describes encounters with loving presences. Some family, others completely new, but all radiating an understanding and compassion that transcends any earthly judgment. Elena, a young woman who passed away at 24, described her astonishment when she was met by her grandmother, not as the frail, sick woman she had known in her last years, but as a radiant and vibrant presence. She looked like she was made of golden light, Elena recalled, and I could feel her love wrapping around me like a protective cloak. Cayce explained that these encounters are carefully orchestrated to provide maximum comfort and guidance for each individual soul. For some, they are dear family members who passed before. For others, they are spiritual guides with whom we had connections in past lives. And for still others, they are angelic presences that never incarnated but vibrate in tune with our deepest essence. What's fascinating is that these guides never impose directions or judge choices. They work as facilitators in the process of understanding and healing. Samuel, a man who had done things he felt deep shame about, described his amazement when instead of condemnation, he encountered beings who helped him understand the roots of his behavior and guided him through a process of reconciliation with himself. They didn't need to tell me what I did wrong, Samuel explained. I already knew. What they did was show me how I got to that point, which old wounds were driving my actions, and how I could finally heal that part of me. These guides seem to have complete access to all our experiences, not just from the life that just ended, but from all our previous existences. They can show us patterns we repeat, lessons we came here to learn, and the greater purpose behind the experiences we lived. Cayce emphasized that this process is never rushed. Each soul receives exactly the time and type of guidance it needs. At some point in this initial journey, every soul describes the perception of a calling. It isn't a sound in the earthly sense, but a pull, an inner knowing that there is a path forward, a light inviting a deeper experience of spirituality. For some souls, this calling is felt almost immediately after the physical transition. For others, especially those with strong earthly attachments or unresolved issues, it might take what we would perceive as time before the calling becomes clear and irresistible. What's fascinating is how this calling manifests in a unique way for each consciousness. Miguel, a passionate musician, described hearing the most perfect harmony. Like every song I ever tried to compose on earth finally found its perfect expression. Meanwhile, Catherine, a nature lover, said she was drawn to a garden of living light, where every flower seemed to contain universes inside itself. This calling represents a threshold, a point of choice where the soul decides to deepen its journey into higher dimensions. Cayce describes this moment as a second death, not a painful or traumatic one, but an additional release, a disentanglement from the last identifications with the earthly existence. What determines when a soul responds to this calling? Cayce identified three main factors. First, the degree of understanding and acceptance of the transition. Second, the level of unresolved emotional attachments. And third, the unique spiritual purpose of that soul. Jennifer, a deeply spiritual woman who had prepared for the transition during her terminal illness, described feeling this calling almost immediately. "It was like I already knew the way back home," she explained. On the other hand, Michael, who died suddenly without any preparation, said he remained in what he called the in-between zone for a considerable period until he gradually understood his new reality. The most important thing is that this calling is never forced. Souls that resist or are not ready are not pushed to move forward. As Cayce often emphasized, in the spiritual realm, free will remains sacred. Every soul moves at its own perfect pace when it is truly ready to let go of the last ties to the world it left behind. One of the most surprising aspects of existence after death is the complete transformation of our experience of time. On Earth, we are conditioned to a linear flow, past, present, and future in ordered sequence. But in the spiritual world, as Cayce revealed in hundreds of readings, time exists in an eternal now, an expanded present where multiple realities coexist simultaneously. Elizabeth, a university professor who passed away after a long battle with cancer, described this experience eloquently. "I could see my funeral happening, my children processing their grief in the months to come, and at the same time, I was already meeting spiritual beings who showed me plans for the future. Everything seemed to happen in one expansive moment." This phenomenon explains one of the biggest mysteries reported by people who have lost loved ones: how the same soul can be seen in different places at the same time. The grandmother who appears in her grandson's dream in Brazil on the same night she leaves a sign for her daughter in Australia isn't traveling between these places. It's present in multiple dimensions at the same time. Cayce called this soul shadowing, the ability of the disembodied consciousness to project aspects of itself into different realities without splitting. Like light passing through several windows at once, the soul can interact simultaneously with different people and situations. What's even more extraordinary is that this phenomenon operates outside the limits of linear spacetime. A soul can offer comfort to a loved one what, for us, would be years later after its departure, while at the same time still processing its own transition in another dimension of reality. It is a concept that defies our earthly logic but becomes perfectly natural once freed from the restrictions of physical consciousness. The soul's path after death is not just an external journey through spiritual dimensions, but mainly an inner journey of deep transformation. Cayce described a gradual and compassionate process through which every soul is guided to let go of its attachments, fears, and limitations. Antonio, a man who had been obsessed with accumulating material wealth, described his process after death. "It was like going through layers of identity. First, I had to recognize that I was no longer the wealthy businessman, the property owner, the influential man. Every identification I let go of brought a feeling of expansion, as if infinite inner spaces were opening up inside me. This process of release doesn't occur through external judgment, but through a loving confrontation with inner truth. The soul is guided to observe the patterns that limited its expression during physical life, not to incite guilt, but to promote understanding and growth. Sophia, a woman who had lived with deep resentment against family members who hurt her, recounted a transforming experience. I was enveloped in an energy I can only describe as unconditional love. In that light, I could see the whole situation from an elevated perspective, the pain my aggressors carried, their own struggles, the bigger pattern connecting our journeys. Forgiveness wasn't something I decided to do. It just happened naturally with that expanded understanding. Cayce emphasized that the time needed for this process of release varies enormously between souls. Some, who lived with greater awareness and cultivated detachment during physical life, go through these stages relatively quickly. Others, more identified with limiting patterns, may remain in processing states for periods that, from our earthly perspective, would seem very long. The fascinating thing is that this process of release isn't theoretical or abstract. It is deeply experiential. The soul is guided to revisit key situations not just as an observer, but as a multidimensional participant, experiencing events from all involved perspectives. It's as if we could finally see the complete movie of our lives, including scenes that were outside our field of vision when we were incarnate. This process is what really prepares the soul to move on to higher dimensions, not through merit or achievement, but by vibrational compatibility. As attachments and limiting identifications are released, the soul's energetic frequency naturally rises, allowing access to subtler and more expansive realities. After the initial process of transition and release, the soul is ready to experience realities that completely transcend our earthly understanding. Cayce described dimensions of existence where thoughts create instantly, where communication happens by direct transfer of consciousness, and where spiritual purpose and evolution continue on deeper and deeper levels. David, a scientist who had dedicated his life to the study of quantum physics, described his amazement upon entering these realms. Everything I had theorized about the fundamental nature of reality was only the tip of the iceberg. I could see how thought, energy, and matter are just different expressions of the same primordial substance. The biggest mysteries of physics that we tried to solve on Earth were perfectly clear from this expanded perspective. What many accounts consistently describe is a feeling of return. Not a discovery of something new, but a recollection of something deeply familiar, as if earthly life had been a temporary dream, and the soul finally woke up to its broader, truer reality. Isabella, an artist, expressed this feeling poetically. It was as if my entire life on Earth had been a dive into deep waters, and now I was emerging back to the surface, remembering who I truly was. All the struggles, pains, and physical limitations seemed so small from this perspective. Not insignificant, but part of a much larger purpose that I could now understand. Cayce revealed in his readings that these higher dimensions are not final destinations but stages in a continuous journey of spiritual evolution. Some souls choose to remain in these realms of light for long periods, deepening their wisdom and expanding their consciousness. Others feel the call to return to earthly experience, bringing fragments of that expanded understanding to help with the collective evolution of humanity. The most surprising thing is that in these dimensions the souls are not isolated on their individual journeys. Cayce described complex networks of spiritual relationships, groups of souls that travel together through multiple existences, helping each other grow. Families, friends, even earthly enemies are often part of these groups, switching roles over different incarnations. Carlos, who had lost his young child in a devastating accident, found deep healing when he discovered, after his own transition, that he and his child were part of the same soul group and had planned this painful experience for reasons of mutual growth. What seemed like a senseless tragedy from an earthly perspective turned out to be part of a deeply loving plan when I saw the full picture. A consistent pattern emerges in almost every account of the advanced stages of the post-death journey, the gradual realization that love is not just a feeling, but the very substance of existence. Cayce described this recognition as the Great Awakening, The moment when the soul finally understands that every experience, every challenge, and every apparent separation was in fact a different expression of a single unifying force. Marcos, a man who had lived a life marked by conflicts and competition, described this realization. It was like all the walls I had built around myself suddenly dissolved. I could see that every person I met on my earthly journey, those I loved and those I considered enemies, were extensions of the same consciousness of which I was also a part. Separation was just an illusion necessary for our evolution. It's at this stage that what many spiritual traditions call a cosmic reconciliation occurs. A profound reunion with the primordial source. Souls describe a merging with the universal light that does not dissolve their individuality but expands it infinitely. Like drops returning to the ocean without losing the memory of their unique journey as drops. Helen, a woman who had suffered immensely during her physical life, expressed this experience in a touching way. All the suffering finally made sense, not because it was necessary or desirable, but because it was transformed and woven into this infinite compassion. Nothing was wasted, each tear, every moment of pain, was a path to this understanding that now filled me. Cayce emphasized that this realization does not only occur at the end of the post-death journey. It can happen with varying intensity at different stages along the process. Moments of this fundamental truth are often granted even in the initial stages of the transition, as flashes of understanding that comfort and guide the soul on its journey. The most extraordinary thing is that when this level of understanding is achieved, the soul does not abandon its connection with the loved ones it left behind. On the contrary, that connection becomes deeper and more significant, although less dependent on physical manifestations. Richard, a father who passed leaving young children behind, explained, "I was now able to love them in a more complete way, without the limitations of my old ego and fears. I was present in their lives in ways that transcended time and space, whispering inspiration in their moments of doubt, celebrating their discoveries as if they were my own." As the soul advances in its understanding and integration, it eventually reaches another point of choice, whether to continue its evolution in spiritual dimensions or return to physical experience for new lessons. Cayce described this process not as an imposed karmic obligation, but as a conscious choice motivated by love and purpose. Sophia, who experienced profound expansion after several phases of integration, described her decision to return. "I could see parts of myself that still needed healing through concrete experience. There were understandings that could only be truly embodied through the limitations and challenges of physical life. I also saw beloved people who needed support on their own journeys, souls with whom I had made old agreements to help each other. This process of preparing for an eventual return is neither rushed nor forced." Cayce emphasized that some souls remain in states of learning and service in the spiritual realms for periods that, in earthly terms, would be equivalent to centuries or millennia. Others feel the call to return more quickly. What's fascinating is that this decision is made with a level of wisdom and foresight that is impossible to imagine from our limited perspective. The soul, assisted by guides and the universal consciousness itself, can visualize different possibilities for future incarnations, not as fixed destinations, but as fields of potential where certain lessons and growth become possible. Jonathan, a musician who departed before fulfilling his creative dreams, explained his process of planning for a new life. "I could see how certain family settings, physical limitations, and even talents would serve as the perfect backdrop for the qualities I needed to develop. What surprised me the most was realizing that some of the greatest challenges were exactly what I had chosen as opportunities for transformation." The most important thing that Cayce emphasized about this cycle of departures and returns is that there is no real loss of consciousness. The soul keeps its essence intact even when it temporarily takes on the limitations of a new physical body. The connections with loved ones, whether they remain in the spiritual plane or return to physical experience, continue on deep levels, manifesting as intuitions, dreams, synchronicities, and that inexplicable sense of recognition when we encounter kindred spirits. What all these accounts and discoveries reveal to us is a deeply comforting truth. Physical death is not an end but a transformation. It is a passage into an expanded state of consciousness where the limitations we once considered so solid and definitive reveal themselves to be temporary and purposeful. Caroline, who experienced all the stages described after her transition, shared this final message. If I could say just one thing to those still living on Earth, it would be this. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid not only of death, but of life in all its fullness. Every experience, every relationship, every challenge is weaving the magnificent tapestry of your spiritual journey. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is truly lost. Cayce often emphasized that the greatest obstacle to a smooth transition is attachment, not just to material possessions, but to limiting identities, unresolved resentments, and accumulated fears. The practice of conscious detachment during physical life not only prepares us for a smoother transition but also deeply enriches our present experience. The most beautiful part of this expanded understanding is that our loved ones who have passed are not lost to us. They remain present, loving, and connected on levels that our physical senses cannot directly grasp, but that our hearts and intuition often recognize. That inexplicable feeling of a presence, that vivid dream, that significant synchronicity. These are all moments when the veil between dimensions becomes momentarily thinner. Before we wrap up this deep dive into the mysteries of the transition, I'd like to ask you to interact with this video. Leave your like, share your own experience or reflection in the comments, and share this with someone who might find comfort in these truths. Every interaction helps bring this message of hope and understanding to more hearts. And remember, the life you're living now is only one chapter in your eternal journey as a soul. Live it with presence, purpose, and love, knowing that every moment of compassion, every act of kindness, every effort to grow and expand your consciousness is creating not only your earthly legacy but also the reality you will experience when you finally return to your true nature as a being of light. Physical death isn't the end of the story. It's just the turning of the page to a new and fascinating chapter of your eternal existence. And as so many souls have discovered on their journey beyond the veil, the love you nurture and share is the only thing you truly take with you.